Developing the knight so early offers flexible options for central control and potential wing attacks, setting a dynamic tone. Opening the diagonal for the bishop and preparing for a solid kingside pawn structure. Claiming central space with this pawn thrust immediately contests the center and opens lines for white's pieces. Unpinning the knight and developing a bishop, but potentially exposing the king's pawn structure prematurely. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this move gently asserts control while keeping options open. Developing the knight here supports the central pawn structure and prepares for potential kingside maneuvering. Asserting central dominion, white expands influence, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially restrict black's knight. Unleashing central tension, black challenges white's pawn structure and opens diagonal lines for piece activity. Asserting central influence and preparing to contest the d-file, this knight aims to solidify white's imposing pawn phalanx. Reinforcing the center and preparing to contest the d4 pawn with subtle piece coordination. Challenging black's bishop directly, white aims to disrupt coordination and potentially gain a pawn if it retreats carelessly. Relocating the bishop allows it to eye the central pawn structure and potentially discourage white's pawn advances while keeping lines open for potential counterplay. Developing the bishop to a useful square, this knight now has more support on the kingside. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure and preparing for kingside castling, this bishop retreat prepares for central operations. Securing the king now frees up pieces to exert pressure on the queen side and potentially exploit the open files. Securing the king with this castling maneuver elegantly dodges any immediate pawn thrusts and allows the rook to join the game. Expanding queenside pawns to gain space, this might be a subtle bid to control the queenside further. Preparing to reposition the rook to a more active file or reinforce the central d5 square after white's pawn expansion. Expanding the queenside gains space and prepares a potential pawn thrust to disrupt black's pieces. Opening the center suddenly invites tactical complications and demands careful calculation from black. Recapturing the pawn here firmly establishes central presence, but consider if freeing black's pieces is worth the knight's new advanced outpost. Exchanging the bishop relieves pawn pressure and opens the e-file, preparing for further queenside expansion. Activating the queen to centralize power and eye the queenside expansion, while preparing to contest open files. Retreating the bishop to f8 relinquishes central control and allows white's queenside expansion to gain further momentum. Securing the central artery, this rook now aims to dominate the d-file, anticipating a potential pawn push or piece deployment. Initiating the g6 maneuver creates a more robust kingside defense while potentially preparing for a later h5 push. Opening the queenside diagonal prepares to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses. Solidifying the pawn chain, this aims to support the upcoming d5 advance and restrict white's pieces. Cracking open the queenside, white aims to gain territory and activate the rook while black consolidates. Establishing queenside counterplay is the immediate objective, seeking to undermine white's advanced pawn chain. This move establishes central control over the c-file, threatening to outflank black's queenside defenders and prepare a potential invasion. Introducing a knight to the central fifth rank promises to disrupt white's well-entrenched pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. Relocating the knight to f3, this feels like a regrouping maneuver, perhaps eyeing the kingside or preparing a more dynamic pawn advance in the center. Reinforcing the central d-pawn now eyes the open d-file for potential pressure and prepares for queenside action. Intensifying pressure on the kingside, this knight maneuver threatens a swift invasion and seeks to exploit black's somewhat exposed monarch. Black shifts the queen, anticipating a potential pawn push on the queenside and preparing to redeploy the knight. Asserting control over the d-file and preparing to pressure black's center. Challenging white's central pawn structure, This move seeks to disrupt harmony and potentially create weaknesses on the queenside. Consolidating the rook on the central file, white aims to fortify its presence and prepare for potential pressure. Seeking to break free from white's suffocating grip, black aims to activate the knight and challenge the central pawns. This bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, eyeing the black king's defenses while supporting a potential queenside expansion. Black solidifies the queenside pawn chain, creating a locked structure and potentially preparing a queenside expansion. Breaching the pawn structure offers an immediate open file for artillery and creates dynamic imbalances for white. Opening the queenside pawns creates dynamic counterplay, but be wary of exposed king activity. Asserting control over the d-file, preparing for potential queenside expansion or a kingside battery. Unleashing a pawn to challenge the knight's forward post, opening diagonal lines. Repositioning the knight seeks to exploit the open kingside files, aiming for a more active role. Reactivating the knight to a central outpost now that the pawn structure is stabilized offers dynamism. Initiating a nuanced knight repositioning, the horse prepares to infiltrate the queenside, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on the edge of the board. Seeking to disrupt white's queenside pawns, black initiates a gradual pawn advance to create counterplay and potentially open a file. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm, white ignites the kingside, seeking to crack open black's defenses and expose the enemy monarch. Challenging the centralized knight, black aims to unravel the kingside attack and possibly exploit the open g-file. Opening the g-file initiates a sharp attack, potentially exposing black's king to immediate danger. Opening the kingside floodgates, this pawn sacrifice unleashes your knights, creating immediate tactical complications and a dynamic imbalance. Seizing the central outpost with this knight drastically restricts black's options and prepares a queenside invasion. Focusing the queen onto the kingside opens dangerous lines of attack against white's potentially exposed monarch. Exploiting the exposed black king, this queen sortie aims to pry open lines and disrupt the opponent's defensive setup. Unlocking a central outpost with the rook, this move injects immediate tactical dynamism, aiming to exploit white's potentially exposed king. Aggressively opening lines around the enemy king offers attacking chances, but creates weaknesses. This retreat allows white's king's knight to find a more dynamic outpost on f5, potentially threatening black's queenside pawn structure. Reasserting central influence, the knight repositions for greater board coverage. A tactical skirmish erupts, simplifying the position and potentially opening lines toward the king. A doubled pawn structure now creates a persistent weakness on the kingside for white, potentially opening attacking avenues. A surprising retreat gifting space on the kingside and allowing white increased piece mobility towards your exposed monarch. The rook's repositioning aims to contest control of the h-file, potentially disrupting black's attacking prospects. Unleashing the pawn storm aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, but it risks weakening the kingside further and creating an isolated pawn for black. Seizing the open g-file grants immediate attacking chances against the black king. Unleashing a pawn avalanche opens lines, but exposes your king to white's lurking knight. Unleashing the rook and pawn structure, the kingside opens, creating immediate tactical possibilities. Securing the weak g-pawn, the bishop now eyes the white king's shelter, aiming to disrupt its safety. Securing the king's escape route via the h-file opens up defensive possibilities should black's initiative falter. Preparing to activate the rook on the open file, aiming to disrupt white's central structure. Reinforcing the rook's position on the 7th rank can be a key to opening up attacking lines. Initiating an aggressive flank attack, black seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure and activate the rook for offensive purposes. Reigniting the kingside attack, the knight surges forward, aiming to disrupt black's vulnerable pawn structure and create new attacking avenues. Reigniting the attack, the knight eyes immediate threats around white's exposed king. Opening the g-file dramatically alters the landscape around the exposed kings. Safeguarding your king becomes paramount after the exchange, as the open g-file now poses a significant threat. A critical fork dislodges the black king's defenses, opening avenues for the white attack. The king desperately seeks safety, but the open files offer no sanctuary. Initiating a decisive king hunt with a forcing check to disrupt black's defenses and pave the way for a material advantage. Seeking shelter from the relentless knight checks, the king cautiously steps towards the edge of the board, hoping to escape the immediate danger. Activating the rook on the open b-file begins a crucial race to seize open lines and exploit the exposed black king. Re-establishing rook control on the open file is crucial for counterplay, challenging white's central pawn structure. A crucial rook exchange simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the exposed enemy king and open files for attacking potential. Recapturing the knight re-establishes material balance, but black's king faces immediate pressure on the dark squares. Sensing vulnerability, the knight retreats, seeking safer squares amidst the evolving pawn structure. Reasserting central presence with the knight opens up possibilities for pawn advances on the king side. Repositioning the rook to the g-file eyes the now exposed black king and prepares potential mating nets. The knight retreats, seeking a safer square after the aggressive pawn push and exchange. The rook on g2 now eyes the open file, preparing for a decisive rook lift or potential exchange. A king now exposed on the king side becomes a prime target for the remaining material. Activating the king by bringing it into the fray offers fresh counterplay in this simplified landscape. Bringing the king into the action is crucial now to support the remaining pawns and fight for central squares. Shifting the knight to d2 prepares for a potential rook lift or a repositioning towards the king side, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. Unleashing the king into the heart of white's weakened position creates dynamic counterplay. The king is finally repositioned to contest the central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances. Awakening the bishop to patrol the crucial dark squares. Securing the d6 pawn with the knight initiates a positional squeeze. Unlocking the bishop's potential now becomes paramount for black amidst this endgame's structural shifts. Clearing the way for the knight to penetrate the queen side. The king boldly ventures into enemy territory, seeking a final outpost before the queens vanish. Piloting the king forward initiates the final stages of the endgame pursuit. Seizing the open c-file offers a chance to disrupt white's coordination and activate the knight. Unleashing a knight check that could force a favorable pawn structure or disrupt black's remaining minor pieces. The knight boldly advances, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and control key squares. Initiating a king march now is crucial to exploit the open diagonals and limited mobility of black's remaining pieces. The king's escape route to the queenside is now blocked, forcing him into a more confined space. Propelling the knight forward challenges the bishop's influence and prepares to exploit the open king. Retreating the king allows the knight to advance, potentially creating a passed pawn down the c-file. Knight fork on the king and rook, forcing a material win and simplifying towards a decisive advantage. The knight's retreat allows the king to activate and potentially support a passed pawn from the queen side. Seizing the open knight file, this capture simplifies into a winning endgame for white. Finally, the isolated pawn on the file becomes a target. Its capture offers a clear path to simplify into a winning endgame. Unleashing a fork to capture the bishop and seize material advantage. Bringing the king towards the center is a common endgame strategy, but here it might expose it to further threats. King embarks on a central march, seeking to dominate the open terrain. The bishop retreats, seeking safety on the longer diagonal while preserving its influence. Activating the knight to contest the open c-file signals a shift towards aggressive piece play. The bishop retreats, regrouping to defend the weak pawn and maintain its influence on the dark squares. Unlocking the kingside with pawn advancement aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. Retreating the bishop here is a concession, allowing white's knight to dominate the d4 square and solidify its presence. Unlocking the f-file opens up aggressive possibilities, threatening to disrupt black's defensive setup. Shifting the bishop to h4 might seem like a defensive maneuver, but it allows white's knight to infiltrate aggressively and could isolate the black king. Finally, opening the queen side offers a new dimension, threatening to unleash the pawn majority's power. Abandoning the pawn at c5 opens a clear path for white's king to penetrate further into the center. Capturing the pawn now forces the black king into a vulnerable square, potentially leading to a swift checkmate sequence. Pushing the pawn offers a slight positional advantage by opening a new pathway for the bishop. Probing the weak bishop's diagonal with the knight secures the advanced pawn and prepares to activate the queen. Opening the file offers no tangible benefit now, with the king so exposed. Introducing a new defender to the queen side, bolstering the pawn structure against further incursions. Focusing the bishop on the kingside pawn majority now, seeking to exploit weaknesses. Opening the path for the knight to rejoin the fight, aiming to exploit the bishop's current passive stance. Shifting the bishop to a more active diagonal targets white's exposed king. The king's decisive march opens the path to secure the remaining pawns. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal to harass white's advanced pawns and potentially disrupt their coronation plans. Sealing the king's escape route with the pawn advances a winning plan. Seeking to consolidate the pawn majority, black aims to prepare for a breakthrough with the king.